Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you on Thursday, the 9th of February. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's assistant editor. Coming up on the show. The ghosts of Downing Street are coming back to haunt the incumbent Prime Minister. For the cover piece this week, our political editor Katy takes a look at the resurgence of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and the problem they pose for Rishi Sunak. She joins me along with our chairman Andrew Neil. As Labour prepares for government, Starmer has taken aim at private schools, promising to make these schools pay taxes should he win the election. Well, Toby Young is here to defend private schools. He joins me with former Labour advisor Fiona Millar. Whilst the Cultural Revolution is still within living memory for China's older generation, how much longer is it going to be remembered for? Journalist Tania Branigan has a new book out on the subject and joins me on the show. And finally, is Joe Biden bringing back America First? Freddy Gray argues so in this week's political column, and he is on the show too. Before we get going, thank you to Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management for sponsoring this episode of The Week in 60 Minutes. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who offer unwavering support in challenging times. Visit candowealth.com for more information. And if you enjoy The Spectator, then do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. This week, Rishi Sunak carried out a reshuffle and reorganised Whitehall, and yet most of the headlines have been dominated by his two predecessors, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, who show no signs of wanting to leave the political stage. In this week's cover article, Katy takes a look at what this means for Rishi Sunak. She joins me now, together with The Spectator's chairman, Andrew Neil. Katy and Andrew, thank you so much for joining me. Now, Katy, tell us about these two ghosts of Prime Ministers past that have been haunting Rishi Sunak this week.
So Rishi Sunak finds himself in quite a unique position whereby he has two very recent predecessors in the House of Commons. Both of whom have plenty left to say. I remember back when Theresa May decided to stay on as a backbench MP when her premiership came to an end, and lots of people said, this is great, it's bucking the trend of figures like David Cameron, who headed for their very expensive shed, and you get all this wealth of experience in the House of Commons. The problem is, I don't think Rishi Sunak will be thinking this anymore about the fact that both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss are sticking around, because you have a situation by which Rishi Sunak is trying to slow things down. You often hear his team, his supporters say, we're going to take the sugar rush away. You journalists had too much fun last year, the year, two prime ministers going, by Tory MPs, not the media. And actually, we're going to slow things down. Michael Gove gave a speech saying, boring is back. But the problem is, if there is a vacuum, and politics tends to abhor a vacuum, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson are on hand to fill it. So Boris Johnson making various interventions, but particularly on Ukraine. Each intervention, you see him ultimately calling for the UK government to go further than they are currently going, and often further than Boris Johnson was willing to go at his time as Prime Minister. And then Liz Truss this week making her comeback, or attempted comeback at least, first with a 4,000-word essay in the Sunday Telegraph, and then an interview with The Spectator on SpectatorTV, in which she's made pretty clear she plans to stick around, make the case for free markets, low tax. That's horrifying plenty of her colleagues, but I don't think that's going to stop her.
Mm-hmm. And Andrew, this means that Liz Truss and Boris Johnson are not going to be the kind of quiet Prime Minister on the backbenches that Theresa May was. It's quite a crowded thing for the Premiership. I mean, Katy writes that there are three in this Premiership now. So does Rishi Sunak need to be worried, or are both of these former Prime Ministers discredited in their own ways?
Oh, I think he should be worried in different ways. And Katy's piece is spot on. Unusual to have a Prime Minister, to have two previous Prime Ministers to worry about. I mean, Margaret Thatcher had quite a lot to worry about. Ted Heath, though he was never really a threat. He just got more and more curmudgeonly as he got older. It's unusual, though, for two former Prime Ministers to be causing trouble. And they're doing so, as Katy points out in her piece, in different ways. Boris Johnson's a clear leadership threat. He believes he was cheated out of leadership. He sees himself as Cincinnatus. He will at some stage be called back, he believes, sooner rather than later, he hopes. We can talk a little bit about how that might happen. Liz Truss, who is not the most self-aware of politicians, but even she realizes nobody's in any rush ever to bring her back. That ain't going to happen. She's more a threat on the ideas side. She's championing low taxation, small government, all the rest of it. I don't think she'll get very far. After all, no one has done more to discredit economic liberalism for a generation than Liz Truss herself. So she's not exactly the best advocate of it. And we live in a era now, for good or ill, of big government consensus on the centre left and the centre right. But the ideas will chip away, cause Mr. Sunak some problem, be pressure on him. But the one he really has to worry about is Boris Johnson.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andrew, just staying on Liz Truss for now, what did you make of her comeback? I mean, as Katy says, on Sunday Telegraph and on the Spectator TV.
I didn't make very much of it. It was a great scoop for Spectator TV, of course. I don't think she had anything very original to say. It was reheated stuff that we'd heard before. There's no great mind at work there. If Hayek is her great ideological lodestone, then it would be good if she learned how to pronounce it. And it's quite hard to take her seriously. I mean, given that the cluster truss basically discredited all the ideas that she stands for. Now, there is a wing of the Conservative Party, of course, that wants lower tax, that wants smaller government, and all the rest of it. And I understand that. And there's no bad thing that a Conservative Prime Minister who is presiding over a high tax, big government regime has some pressure on that. But there are forces at work far bigger than Liz Truss. The pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the requirement now to onshore supply lines on everything from pharma to gas to energy and so on. The need to have an industrial strategy, which everybody seems to think we need. Even America's got one now, subsidizing industries so that they come onshore. All of that is big government. And the choice of the next election will not be between a version of the Liz Truss economics and the Labour Party. It will be a big government Conservative choice versus a big government Labour choice as well. That's the mood we're in. I think we're in it for the rest of the decade. I don't see how that's going to change very quickly. And of course, Boris Johnson is the original big government Conservative as well. So you don't really, if you were, for some, had a rush of blood to the head, which the Tory party has quite often, and suddenly thinking bringing Boris Johnson back was the answer, and you're not bringing back small government and lower taxes. You're bringing back a former Prime Minister who never saw a spending programme he didn't like, even a bridge, or was it a tunnel, I can't remember, to Ireland.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Katy, this is what Liz Truss's allies in Parliament, which she still has some of, are worried about, isn't it? I mean, this is something that she said in that interview, that these arguments are not being made, that the window for discussion has been moved. And yet this growth caucus is there. Do they tell us about that? Because they've met this week.
Yeah, so they meet weekly, and they're called the Conservative Growth Group. They decided not to call themselves the Growth Research Group because that tends to suggest you're very hostile to the Prime Minister. And its members, they're about 40, insist that they're actually, they want to help Rishi Sunak. I'm not convinced Rishi Sunak thinks they're that helpful. But when it comes to these talks, so I think ahead of the spring budget, they're trying to suggest there should be, more growth policies. Now, we obviously have to be a bit careful here because it's quite hard to find a politician, maybe there's one in the Green Party, but who is anti-growth. Instead, Keir Starmer talks about it. Rishi Sunak said it's one of his 5 priorities. What we're talking about is how you go about it and the pace. And this group want to affect the budget, but also particularly, the budget before the next election. I think that's where they think there should be, the greatest pressure for tax cuts. Rishi Sunak has said the public aren't idiots. They know why he can't cut tax right now. That does imply he thinks there are people in his party who are idiots, whether or not he meant to. But I think in terms of how the growth group is seen, you have a situation where there are some MPs who think yes, they want to influence some things now, but it's actually a caucus that in the event of a Tory loss, which currently all the polls point to as the most likely scenario at the next election, you would have this caucus kind of keeping the free market idea alive so they could have their own candidate. Now, if you had a very bad loss, there is a sense amongst Tory MPs that the party would likely move to the right, and this is where they could be quite influential. But there is one point where you wonder if the Boris Johnson group and the Liz Truss group could combine. After my piece went up, I had, one former minister get in touch and say, if they were number 10, they would be quite worried about these two, former prime ministers, the ghosts of prime ministers past, because while, as Andrew points out, Boris Johnson is not, a slimmed down state Tory, he has a sense about him where there'll be figures in the growth group who associate Boris Johnson, despite this, with being a conservative leader or a person that they can influence with their policies. And therefore you have a group about 20, 30 diehard Boris Johnson loyalists, and then you have a group of about 40 Trussite MPs who feel Rishi Sunak isn't listening to them. If they come together, that starts to be a group that could cause some problems if you have very bad local election results.
Really interesting, especially as the Truss caucus doesn't seem to recognise that the energy bill doesn't seem to be ideologically in sync with what they're saying that they believe in.
Well, and I think in the interview that was one of the points where Spectator editor Fraser Nelson made the point, which is, well, it seems the energy package is about 60% of your not so mini budget, and surely that is borrow and spend rather than what you're talking about in terms of a slimmed down state.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Andrew, what do you think about the local elections then? Because Katy writes in her piece that some Sunak aides are worried about bad local election results leading for Boris Johnson to have some kind of Cincinnatus-like return to the front line.
Well, let's think what's going through Boris Johnson's mind at the moment, given that he sees himself as Cincinnatus. How soon should he try the return? Now, some people may say to him, well, look, Tories are going to go down come the next election. They'll be all to play for. Sunak will have to resign as Tory leader if he leads them to bad defeat. This is your chance to get back again, be Tory leader, and so on, and begin the fight back. That's fine. Does anybody seriously think Boris Johnson wants to be leader of the opposition for 5 years? Which would crib and confine his ability to earn any money for a start. He's not a natural leader of the opposition. Opposition is not in his makeup. It's a lot of hard grind. As Keir Starmer is finding out, Mr. Johnson is not suited to hard grind. So I don't think waiting that long is really his option, and an option that appeals to him. Much more appealing is that he believes that he could turn things around. This side of the election, that he's the one, if he gets back in, having been cheated as he sees it, he can get back in and save the day for the Conservatives. My own view is that's cloud cuckoo land, but that seems to be where half the Tory party lives these days, so they'll probably agree with that. This does make the May elections, I think, more dangerous than Mr. Sunak and those around him realise. Because if I'm right, and Mr. Johnson hasn't got the patience to wait for an election defeat and thinks his role as Cincinnatus is to be back this side of the next election, to save the day for the Tories this side of the election, to propel him back as Prime Minister, then he has to strike before the election. And if the May results are bad, I'm not saying that triggers a Johnson challenge, but it will start to lay the groundwork for the skids being under Mr. Sunak. And then he'll be entirely dependent on return to growth to the economy, to a sense that we're not in serious decline, that nothing works in Britain. He really will have to be seen to be turning Britain around. And I think that is a big ask. So if Boris Johnson is going to strike at all, I think it will be in good time to be leader before the next election. And the May elections of this year will be a crucial building block in Boris Johnson's return scenario and strategy.
Katy?
I agree with Andrew in the sense that if we get to those May local elections, I think that is the danger point. Now, it's not so much that perhaps overnight you'll see Boris Johnson try to mount a comeback. I think when you speak to people who are starting to whisper the idea that if the polls aren't moving at all, which they don't really seem to be moving at all, maybe you have to think the unthinkable, and would Boris Johnson be the only thing that could change things? Now, there's lots of good reason to be sceptical in the sense that I'm sure Boris Johnson would win the Tories some support in some areas, but vice versa, would probably lose the Tories some support in some areas. And if you look where Rishi Sunak polls well compared to Boris Johnson. But I think if you had very bad May local elections, it could just add to that sense that things are not working out, and then you potentially have a build up into the summer where lots of people are talking about it more. So I think it could be perhaps, you get something abrupt, but also I think it could be that turning point in terms of how MPs look at Rishi Sunak. And I think one of the problems for number 10 is there was a sense in government, despite the fact everyone will tell you they don't expect the polls to change overnight. I think the MPs thought there would be a slow creep in the sense that,
in the right direction.
Yeah, exactly. Every couple of weeks, they'd chip a poll off Labour, and actually things look pretty static. And Rishi Sunak's poll ratings are coming down and more towards where the Tory party is than Rishi Sunak lifting up the Tory party, which is obviously what would need to go right for him. Now, I still think we're some way off Rishi Sunak being, pushed out. And even if there was a Boris Johnson comeback, there's a different thing, which is an attempt at a restoration and it being successful. But I am struck in the past few weeks that you just are having a few more people and, perhaps people who were never massive Rishi Sunak fans, but they're being a little bit more vocal now. It's almost the truth of everyone being quite well behaved after how the Liz Truss premiership ended, looking into the bits and thinking, we need to try and pull ourselves together. I think that is wearing off at this point.
Well, Andrew, I just can't believe we're having this conversation at all about Boris Johnson coming back. I mean, it's less than a year since he left Downing Street. Should the Conservatives just resign themselves to losing the next election instead of just messing the country around in the next 18 months again?
Well, I think a lot of them are resigning themselves to losing the next election. And you're right, it is a bizarre conversation to have, given the manner in which Mr. Johnson left Downing Street entirely of his own making, not even over policy, entirely over, it was death by 1,000 cuts. And the cuts were made worse because he tried to deny there were any cuts in the sense of any parties in Downing Street that he knew of. All nonsense that undermined him in the end, and he made it much, much worse. But the reality is that there has been, as Katie's saying there, no Sunak bounce in the poll. That it's clear Mr. Sunak, for all his many attributes and serious purpose and hard work and brains, there is no X factor there, no X factor that's leading to any measurable change in the polls, and a mountain to climb in terms of getting the country back on track again. And you add all that up, and the fact that Mr. Johnson is waiting in the wings and believes that he can come back, then that does make Mr. Johnson more dangerous. It does seem to me, however, to use a technical term, bonkers to think that this would result in the Tories coming back, because it would be an incredible leap into the unknown again. I mean, Boris Johnson is a form of political long COVID. That people that he's touched in his time as Prime Minister and before, it comes back to haunt them. You don't think that? Ask the chairman of the BBC. Ask these Tony donors. Ask the woman who provided the gold wallpaper or whatever it was for 10 Downing Street. Just see what happens when this parliamentary inquiry gets underway as to whether he lied to Parliament or not about the parties. We've still to go through all that yet, and that'll all be public. That will all be on the television airwaves. So it seems to me it's a huge risk. You don't know what's going to come out of the woodwork with Boris Johnson, and when it does come out, it's usually not something very pleasant. So that's why I just think it would be a crazy risk. But I don't rule out the Tory party in its current state taking that risk.
And I think the very fact we're having this discussion points to what I think is the most likely problem for Rishi Sunak, which is one he's actually really experiencing right now, which is, yes, there is a chance of Boris Johnson come back before the next election, but for the reasons Andrew just talked us through, so the Privileges Committee, we also have the resignation honours list by Boris Johnson whenever that comes out, which is going to be a massive political headache, and it's going to become Rishi Sunak's problem. It's going to become the Tory party's problem. So all these things, Boris Johnson's interventions and various issues, there's worries that Boris Johnson could talk about the Northern Ireland Protocol if there's a deal in the coming weeks, means that even without a comeback, Boris Johnson is proving a problem for Rishi Sunak and is just adding to the sense that it's hard for Rishi Sunak to turn the page or even make his own impression with the public when you have such big characters still lurking around who are not shy about coming forward.
Well, Katy and Andrew, thank you very much for joining Spectator TV. Speaking of the next election, Keir Starmer is starting to put forward Labour's policy platform, including a proposal to start levying VAT on private schools. But Toby Young writes in this week's magazine that this wouldn't raise any money and doesn't even tackle that big of an unfairness. He joins me now, together with Fiona Millar, a campaigner for comprehensive schools and a former education advisor to Tony Blair. So, Toby, for the magazine this week, you write that Labour's policy to add taxes onto private schools would lose the Treasury money, harm social mobility, and won't make the education system fairer. Can we start with the first part of that? I mean, how would the Treasury actually lose money by levying this tax?
Yeah, well, Labour estimates that this will raise about 1.7 billion, and it's announced, I think, various things it intends to spend this bounty on. But according to an analysis by a financial consultancy company called Baines Cutler, which provides consultancy services to independent schools, it would actually lose the Treasury money. And the way they work this out is, first of all, I mean, I think that where Keir Starmer has got the 1.6 billion from, the 1.7 billion is, first of all, 1.6 would just be multiplying what parents are currently paying by way of private school fees by 20%. And then you add the additional amount that private schools will be paying when they're forced to pay full business rates. But the problem is that when you make school fees liable for VAT, schools can then claim back some of the VAT they're paying on supplies, which means they can probably lower their fees a little bit. And according to Baines Cutler, actually the bounty will be more like 15% of what parents are paying now rather than 20%. And in addition, and this is the really critical factor, because that will nevertheless make private school fees unaffordable for vast swathes of parents. People imagine that if you're sending your child to a private school, you're very wealthy, you're a member of the super rich. Not true. Often middle-class families making sacrifices, one partner giving up all their salary to pay children's school fees. So if they do go up, I mean, it's price sensitive. If they do go up, Baines Cutler estimates that about a quarter of private school students will move into the state sector. So that's reducing the take by another 25%. But critically, if they have to move into the state sector, the state then has to pay to educate them in the state sector. And not only does that mean paying for more teachers, it also means building new classrooms. And Baines Cutler estimate that the total cost to the Treasury will be about 416 million a year over the 5-year period of the next Labour government.
Well, Fiona, do you agree with those calculations?
Well, I mean, the first point to make is that the government's own figures say that the school roll is going to drop by £1 million a million pupils over the next decade. So that there is a lot of spare capacity in the system. And to give you one example, I mean, there are 80,000 school places in London at the moment that aren't filled and 90,000 pupils in the private sector. So they could easily be accommodated without any extra cost. And I mean, this 25%, it seems, is a sort of rough estimate. Nobody knows how many parents would come back into the state sector. But for me, it isn't even a matter really of the money. It's a matter of principle. There are 8 million children in state schools, including our own, Toby, who are funded at about £5,000 per pupil per year. There are 500,000 children in private schools funded at approximately £15,000 a year. And that's fundamentally unfair. You cannot have a system where a small minority of children are funded to such an extent that's then subsidised by the taxpayer in this way. So I think it's a political argument. We don't believe in subsidising the education of the most well-off in society. We believe in redistributing the money, however much it is, to the least well-off, who bloody well need it at the moment.
I think you've got it back to front, Fiona. It's not that the taxpayers are subsidising private school parents. It's the other way around. Private school parents are paying twice over for education, once for their own children's education and the second time for other people's children's education. And, you know, it seems to be looking a gift horse in the mouth to say to these parents who are paying twice over for education and paying for other people's children as well as their own, sorry, you're going to have to pay more for your own children's education. I mean, aren't they paying enough given that they're paying twice?
You don't say to people, please leave the National Health Service and go privately to save the state money. We want public services that are used by everybody across the community. That's what gives them their status and their validity in society. If they become just a rump service for poorer people, they're done for. So I think we want public services to be used by everyone, and I would welcome back all those parents into the state sector, and I'm sure they'll find it's much better than they think it is, and they would enrich all their local state schools. As you've always known, I make that case.
Well, we can go back and forth about whether it would actually cost the taxpayer money or the taxpayer would gain. But let's just take it for granted that it's costing.
But can I ask you a question? Do you accept that it is fair that a small group of pupils in this country are funded to such a lavish extent compared to the majority of children in the state. Do you think that's fair?
One of the points I make in my article, Fiona, is that about 5 years ago, I was the co-author, along with several people, of a paper that was published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal in which we looked at the GCSE performance of a group of private school pupils and a group of pupils at state schools, controlling for all the characteristics they arrived at the schools with. So prior attainment, parental socioeconomic status, the genetic markers associated with educational achievement. And we found that if you control for all those factors, the GCSE results of children in private schools are really no different to the GCSE results of children in state schools.
Toby, does the inequality come a bit later down the line then when it comes to universities? Because private school children are disproportionately more likely to get into Oxbridge, for example.
Yeah, but you can't just look at that, Cindy. You have to look at whether, if you control for all the characteristics they bring with them, when they arrive at the school, they're still doing better. And children with those same characteristics at state schools are just as likely to get into universities. You can't just look at the percentage of people in private schools who get into universities. You have to look at whether they're actually getting a leg up in virtue of going to private schools. And the evidence suggests they're not.
Well, in terms of exam grades, no. But of course, there's a lot more to private education than just the exam results. And anyway, you're talking about one sliver of state school educated pupils. The ones I'm talking about are the poorest ones who'd never been in the private sector in the first place. You're paying for the sports facilities, you're paying for the contacts, you're paying for the tutors in the sixth form who help you get into Oxford and Cambridge, you're paying for the drama, you're paying for the enrichment, you're paying for the school trips and things. You know that is just not affordable in the state sector at the moment. That's fundamentally unfair.
You could say it's unfair that some people live in bigger houses. But I think let's look. You say, Fiona, that you're concerned about the least well-off children and how they're doing in state schools. I say in my article, and I think this is an argument you'd understand, that if you force lots of aspirational middle-class parents to educate their children in the state sector because you make private school fees unaffordable, they're going to find places in the highest performing state schools, and that's going to push out. We know this, you know.
The poorest children are not in the highest performing state schools.
When a school is doing well, a state school, a good comprehensive, middle-class parents will move heaven and earth. They'll game the system to get their children in, whether it means going to church and pretending to be pious Christians, buying property in the catchment area of the school, whatever it takes, they'll do it to get their child into the high-performing school. And the children that will suffer as a result of all that migration from the private to the state sector are the disadvantaged children that currently can.
But they're not in those schools, Toby. They're not in those schools. You know that perfectly well. They're not in those schools. They're not in the grammar schools. They're not in the selective church schools. They're in the schools that, you know, don't fiddle their admissions in that way. And incidentally, you know perfectly well that I've always been in favour of admissions reform. So I would make that a big Labour policy alongside this one, so that you did make access to the best schools more accessible to the poorest children. I'm just interested in how we invest more money in the education of the poorest children in society at a time when the gap is widening, not narrowing, between the richest and the poorest. And I think it's frankly obscene that the funding differentials between the state and the private schools are so extreme that anything we can do to narrow that is a good thing. And I think that's what this proposal is attempting to do.
But Fiona, if the sums don't add up in the way that Toby has set out, what is the point?
I don't accept they don't add up, because I think there's plenty of capacity in the state system. And I've told you the government's own figures say there are going to be 1 million extra places in the next decade. There's plenty of capacity in the state system, as it is funded at the moment, to absorb extra children. In fact, the state system would very much love to have those extra children, because otherwise state schools are going to have to close.
Fiona, the schools which have spare capacity are the least successful schools, the schools that parents don't want to send their children to. And the middle-class children, the refugees from the private sector, you know as well as me, are not going to end up in those schools. It's the children they push out of the better schools that are going to be shunted into those low-performing schools with spare space.
I can give you many examples of state schools that have been turned around by the arrival of a group of motivated middle-class parents, and I'm sure you know many of them yourself. So what I'm saying is that the money is there to fund 1 million pupils at the moment who won't be there in 10 years' time, so that it's not going to cost the state any more money if 150,000 children come in from the state sector. And also, as you perfectly well know, these private school places are distributed very unequally across the country. They tend to be in certain cities, and there are huge swathes of the country that don't have many children in private education. So in places like London, where there are a lot of extra school places at the moment, it would be perfectly easy to accommodate them, even in what are perfectly good schools at the moment.
Can we talk a little bit more about something that both of you have mentioned, which is how middle class parents game the system? Fiona, you mentioned admissions reform. How would that look like when it comes to the state sector? Because I went to a grammar school and I saw lots of middle class parents who probably could have afforded private education, but because my grammar school was so good, they put them into the catchment area and to put them through the 11 plus for that school, and as you say, pushed out people who otherwise would have got there. But
the 11 plus is the biggest middle class swindle to get into school, because you can pay for coaching for your children from the age of 7 or 8 to pass the test. And that's why the grammar schools have very, very few children eligible for free school meals or the pupil premium. So that needs to go for a start. I think the way that many church schools admit their pupils need to be looked at. And I think that the proximity criteria need to be looked at, because that means people can buy houses in those areas. I would certainly reform all that as well. That would be a bigger priority for me in a way, but we're not talking about that at the moment. We're talking about charitable.
Successive Labour governments have failed to enact those admissions.
I'm not a member of the Labour Party. I'm not arguing.
It's not going to happen. It's politically too difficult. It's too unpopular. Grammar schools are located in marginal constituencies.
You asked the question, so I'm answering it.
Using this policy as a kind of elixir which will cure unfairness in the system, but that without admissions reform, it'll just have a negative impact on social mobility, not a positive one. And can I make another point in connection with social mobility, Cindy, which is that at the moment, in order to retain their charitable status, independent schools do an enormous amount of work to try and help less advantaged children get a step up. So about 85% of independent schools have partnership arrangements with local state schools. The school that I helped set up in West London, the West London Free School, has an arrangement with Latimer, a next door private school. They let us use some of their facilities.
Yeah, crumbs from the rich man's table, exactly.
There are 40,000 pupils in the independent school sector that benefit from scholarships and bursaries. Keir Starmer himself was the beneficiary of a bursary when he went to Reigate Grammar School. All those children currently getting a leg up, being given a helping hand by the independent sector. It won't stop altogether, but they won't have the same incentive to engage in that partnership work, to create those bursary places, if there's no tax benefit to retaining their charitable status.
1% of children in the private sector are on full bursaries. Right, and unless you're on a full bursary, it's going to be quite expensive for you. Some of those bursaries are offered to families who earn £100,000 a year plus. And they're mostly linked to academically selective tests. So you're not going to be, perfectly well, you're not going to be taking in the most disadvantaged primary school pupils. You're going to be taking in the pupils who have coached or have kept up through primary school to pass the selective test. And the question I always ask private school heads is, how many children in your schools do you have who are eligible for the pupil premium? Or how many are there across the independent sector? Answer comes there, none, because they don't count them, because there aren't any. And frankly, if these schools were doing so much to address disadvantage, they should be able to answer that question. Don't you think?
I'm sure. Well, I think the figures I've got are that 40,000 children benefit from bursaries and scholarships.
But they're families who they can earn upwards of 40, 50, 60,000 pounds a year.
But nonetheless, they're making school fees affordable for those who currently can't afford it, because they're not particularly well off. It's a myth to think that only the super rich can afford private education.
But why is making school fees affordable for a tiny proportion of people? Why would that be our priority when we're talking about levelling up? What we should be worried about is what's happening to those millions of children who are not funded well enough to get the chances in life that they need. And if this policy can even throw £500,000 back into the state sector, frankly, it's a good thing in my view.
Can I suggest a middle ground here? Instead of scrapping charitable status altogether, can we say that the threshold you have to meet to get charitable status, the stuff you have to contribute back to the community, back to your local state schools, has to be much, much higher? Toby, I hear what you're saying about these statistics, but I think we all know private schools that do the bare minimum in order to kind of meet some kind of charitable responsibility. Private schools who let the local state school use their swimming pool for 2 hours a week or something like that. That's just not enough, even if you count the bursaries. Why don't we say raise the threshold? If you can meet the threshold where you're really helping local state schools, then you can keep that charitable status. And if you can't, then you don't. Do you think that would work, Toby?
I've got no objection to making the burdens on governors of independent schools even higher to retain their tax benefits. But I just can't see how you can believe that charging VAT on school fees and charging full business rates on school buildings is actually going to bring in money, given that the number of children that will have to move out of that sector and be educated in the state sector as a consequence. Even if there are empty places, you're still going to have to employ more teachers Fiona.
well,
the state will have
those
to employ
teachers
more
are
teachers
currently
than it
employed.
otherwise would if those children were continued to be educated in the private sector.
No, those teachers are currently being employed by the state sector, because as pupils go, you won't need as many of them. So the budget is there now. But the point is, I think that is a very good idea. And so what about this for an idea? Why don't we say to the independent schools, if you want to keep your charitable status, you take in the pupils who are hardest to teach, most likely to be excluded, can't pass your academic selective tests, live at the council flat that most of those parents are trying to get their children away from. Why don't you take them in and let's see what they say? I can tell you what they'll say. They won't want it because that's not what their parents are paying for.
It's an interesting point, Fiona, which is that many pupil referral units, many special schools, schools for children with special educational needs are independent schools. They charge fees. Usually those fees are paid by the local authority, not in every case. When Labour says it's going to charge VAT on independent school fees and charge full business rates for school buildings in the private sector, does it mean those schools as well? And if not, how's it going to differentiate between some private schools but not all private schools?
I think we're going to have to leave it there because we are running out of time. But Fiona and Toby, thanks very much. And I hope that Keir Starmer or someone in Labour is watching, because maybe we've come out with a middle ground. If you enjoy Spectator TV, why not subscribe to the magazine as well? You can get 12 weeks of The Spectator in print and online for just £12. On top of that, we'll give you a £20 Amazon gift voucher for free. Go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer. Now, you might think that the Cultural Revolution is completely censored in China, but a new book sheds light on the ways in which those 10 years of madness are still commemorated today. Red Memory is by journalist Tania Branigan and is reviewed in the magazine this week. She joins me now. So, Tania, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, the term Cultural Revolution has been bandied around a lot in the last few years as the West talks about the culture wars and we talk about campus freedom of speech and all this sort of stuff. But anyone reading your book will be able to see that actually the real Cultural Revolution was much more serious than anything that we've seen here. So can you remind viewers of the violence of the real one that happened in China in 1966?
Yes, it was absolutely devastating. There were tens of millions of people who were hounded. Around 2 million people died, sometimes beaten to death, sometimes executed, sometimes killing themselves because they were under such huge pressure. So the human toll was absolutely immense. But of course, the other thing that was really distinctive about it was that it was really driven from the top. It was Mao's attempt to reassert his supremacy. And that's one of the many reasons why I think it's so misleading to sort of try and draw comparisons between that and what we see today.
Mm-hmm. And when we say people were hounded, they were hounded for what's been seen as not revolutionary enough.
Yes, for thought crimes, essentially, for being seen as not revolutionary enough. In many cases, simply for their family background. Even infants in the worst cases were killed because they were seen as belonging to landlord families. So people could, for all sorts of reasons, fall foul either in the early stages of the Red Guards, these sort of political vigilantes, but then in the later stages when it became sort of more bureaucratic, really, and the revolutionary committees had taken over again, people were being tortured and killed for their sort of supposed part in conspiracies, which really never existed or only existed in sort of absolutely tiny form. And that these campaigns would sort of spiral out of control and suck so many people in.
And it only really ended with the death of Mao, but that happened in 1976. So I think it was so extensive across the country and so recent in living memory, really, of all Chinese families. And my family, we have our own stories. My mum and her siblings still remember being taken in by relatives when her own parents were being denounced. So it's no wonder that the country still remembers, at least within families. But your book is also about the public memory of the Cultural Revolution. Can you tell us about that? Because it seems like such a politically sensitive period that surely the Chinese Communist Party is embarrassed by it. But yet there are still places and moments where you can have public memory of that time.
So it's quite a complex one, I think. It's not completely taboo in the way that, for example, the crackdown in 1989 on the pro-democracy protesters was. But it's certainly always been sensitive, and it's become much more so over the years. It's become much more tightly policed in discussions. There's very little discussion of it officially. Only occasionally is it sort of raised as this kind of bogeyman, this idea of sort of the turmoil that China could slip back into if the authorities don't keep tight control on things. In general, it's been much more about sort of controlling that space and preventing people from talking about it. And alongside that, of course, has gone the personal trauma, which has often prevented so many people from speaking about it. But there are people who have come forward. I mean, that was really what united the people in red memory, the fact that they were all people who'd chosen to remember in some way. And there are certain elements of it, or particularly there's one element of it that the party is willing to remember and even to celebrate, which is this period in which 17 million young people, I mean, as young as sort of 14 in many cases, were sent off down to labour in the countryside thinking they were going to be there forever. It was devastating for them. I mean, these were incredibly poor areas. They were struggling to make a living. A significant number of them never came back. They were sort of killed in work accidents or they died of malaria. And yet this is the one part that the party will remember because, of course, Xi Jinping was among the people who was sent down. He spent around 7 years toiling in the countryside. And so essentially the party says, well, look, he has seen what it's like to live in these grueling conditions. He knows how tough it is for ordinary Chinese people. He can endure the worst. He can take this on. And really, he's one of you.
Well, I think the question of how this has impacted President Xi is such a fascinating one. It's one I've looked at on my podcast, Chinese Whispers. But you would think that a trauma like this, directed very much from the Chinese Communist Party, where Xi's own father was a senior official and then purged although before the Cultural Revolution, you would think that something like this would traumatize a young man to the extent to make him a critic of the CCP rather than the leader of it now. So how do you think it has impacted him?
Well, it's so fascinating, isn't it? Because people have reacted to this time in such different ways. And there's no better example of that, really, than Xi Jinping himself. So obviously, his father was a revered figure who suffered greatly in the time. His elder sister, in fact, we believe his half-sister killed herself because of the political pressure the family was under. So there's no doubt it was incredibly painful for him. And yet, while his father and other party elders, when they were rehabilitated afterwards, did their utmost to ensure that there were sort of safeguards, that there could never be a strongman leader of Mao's kind again, and set up all these sort of norms for collective rules, such as agreements on term limits and things like this. She has really torn all of that up. And of course, he's now China's indefinite leader. He's done 2 terms and he's carrying on. We don't know how long he's going to be there. He's dismantled a lot of the safeguards that were there. And it seems quite perverse in a sense, but I suppose you could argue that really the lesson he took was that politics is very unpredictable. And if you are anywhere near the top, you want to be in charge and you want to have a really tight grip on what's going on. And I think particularly for him, that idea, which runs quite deep, I think, among people, you can't have any sort of space there for dissent, that when people start to dissent, that is dangerous. You don't want the masses to be involved in any way. And so while he's been very good, much better than sort of the last couple of leaders at shaping a message that speaks to ordinary people, this kind of emotional narrative for China that speaks to the masses, he's also clearly imposed very sort of tough political constraints of a type that we really hadn't seen for a long while.
Yes, absolutely. But the party's reaction to the Cultural Revolution hasn't always been as tightly controlled as it seems these days, because immediately afterwards, in 1981, you had this resolution where the party itself tried to make sense of it. So can you tell us about what the party's own narrative about the Cultural Revolution was at that time? And is that why there are these moments, gaps in which you find Cultural Revolution museums, Cultural Revolution galleries, even Cultural Revolution themed restaurants? Is that why it manages to not be as taboo as the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989?
So there's no doubt that in some ways, actually, memories of the Cultural Revolution were quite useful in the aftermath of Mao's death in helping the country's new leaders to sort of move the country forward. And particularly under Deng Xiaoping, when he wanted to take this turn towards the market, it really justified the move away from orthodox Maoism. The fact you had this sort of outpouring of what was called scar literature, the memoirs and the novels sort of talking about how terrible it had all been. And it really reminded people of the need to move away from the years of Maoism and towards this very new vision of China that was obviously, while enticing for some, obviously must have seemed quite threatening, brought insecurity with it for many. Those kinds of memories, I suppose, did what the party wanted them to, and then they wanted to move on from there. They certainly didn't want people to dwell on it. So in fact, even when the official verdict was being drafted, one of the things that Deng said to the people working on it was that the point of this was really to help people unite and look forward. It wasn't the kind of remembering that countries sometimes do when they say never again, we're going to, focus on this and make sure nobody forgets. It was about saying, we're going to deal with this subject. We're going to decide we're going a new way, and then we're going to move on. Don't keep looking backwards. And so official references to the Cultural Revolution now are so sort of glancing. The official verdict stands that this was a catastrophe, that Mao was really led astray by the Gang of Four and Lin Biao, but it's not something that the party wants people to think about. And so while it did create a certain amount of space for scholars of the Cultural Revolution, for people who wanted, as you say, to set up Cultural Revolution museums and so forth, it was a very limited space, and they've always had to battle. The museum is a classic example of something that has survived by being below the radar. So once it started getting a lot of visitors, they started sort of taking the signposts down and they stopped the press reporting on it. It was allowed to survive, but it wasn't allowed to thrive. And the other thing I think that's really important to remember is that so much of what goes on in China, obviously, is about people taking the initiative, finding spaces, creating spaces. And there was a point where civil society, and scholars and historians had clawed out a certain amount of space to talk about difficult aspects of China's history through their sort of dedication and their courage. And that's really something that has been reined in. The party has reasserted a kind of political orthodoxy. So many of these initiatives just wouldn't be possible now. We've even seen, magazines such as Annals of the Yellow Emperor, which was this very bold magazine, sort of mostly made up of sort of octogenarians looking, usually from within the system, looking back at the country's history. That's really been sort of taken over. That whole sphere, I think, has really been severely restricted, almost shut down.
Well, Tania, what does this mean for future generations of China then? Because as I say, it's within living memory, but certainly not within my living memory. When future generations come in China, and if it's not publicly known in the ways that you're talking about being tightened up, what does that mean for how much the Chinese know about what happened in those 10 years in the future?
Well, I think one thing that's so striking is that even when they know a little bit, they don't really understand it. And so we saw this case, for example, where students were very heavily criticised on social media because they'd taken these graduation photos where they sort of mocked up struggle scenes as if they were posing in these sort of denunciation sessions from the Cultural Revolution, which, of course, many survivors found highly offensive. But we were also talking about a generation that had never really been allowed to learn in full about what the Cultural Revolution actually meant. So it seemed to me entirely unsurprising that they wouldn't grasp actually what they were mimicking. So I think there is a real issue. Many people, as I said, older people simply aren't willing to talk about it at all. So a very common thing is that people either know that something has happened in their families, but nobody's willing to talk about it. In some cases, they don't know at all. So one of the psychotherapists I spoke to who was working with victims of the Cultural Revolution actually said it was only when she started doing the work that she realised something had happened within her own family. And what's so striking about the work of the psychotherapists like her is that they've found the effects of the Cultural Revolution carrying on not only into children, but even into grandchildren. The traumas reproduced often, perhaps especially where families haven't been able to speak about them, but the way it's shaped and scarred those people, that those effects are still being felt and will continue to be felt, I think, until perhaps China is ready to address this.
Mm-hmm. Well, Tania, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV, and I'm sure your book will be adding to the memory of that period. Thanks again. And finally, Biden delivered his State of the Union address this week, an annual event famous for its pomp and pageantry. The takeaway seems to be that Biden is as much into America first as Trump was, writes Freddy Gray in this week's political column. He also hosts our Americano podcast. Freddie joins me now. So, Freddie, welcome to Spectator TV.
Hello, Cindy.
Hello. Tell us about Biden's main messages in his State of the Union speech this week.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say it was actually a good speech. I think it was the best speech I've heard Biden give since he's been president.
Okay.
He didn't sound frail. He didn't stumble too much. There was a couple of weird slips and a couple of strange moments. Like when he was talking about China, he said he suddenly got very angry for no obvious reason,
right,
and said, "No leader in the world, name me one leader in the world who would swap places with Z right now. You can't name one."
Oh, okay.
It's very odd, because I could think of a few actually, but anyway, apart from that, it wasn't a very foreign policy based speech.
Yeah.
Last year he started on Ukraine, because obviously that was the big story at the time, and it very much dominated his State of the Union address, his first State of the Union address. This year it was very much, I've called it in this speech, it was sort of a Biden America First speech. And actually you understood, listening to it, you understood the ways in which he's adapted Trump's economically populist message in a sort of politically correct way. So there's a lot of Buy American stuff, which he said before. There was a lot of sort of, corporate America needs to pay up messaging. So to kind of reach out to the left of his party economically. But really it was a pitch to America. It was also saying, because he was speaking for the first time to a Republican majority in the House, it was saying, I'm going to work with you, while brilliantly sort of undermining him. It was very clever the way he said, for instance, he was talking about bringing down the cost of drug prices for everyday Americans, and he turned to the House, who were heckling him, to the Republican side of the House, and said, don't worry, Big Pharma's still going to get their money. And that's good politics, because it makes Republicans look like sort of lobbied shills for Big Pharma.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that he's quite good at, isn't he? Just trying to be cross-partisan, also appealing to a bit more blue-collar voters and policies and stuff like that. So, in some respect, it's probably the best of what he should be.
Yeah, I think it's his comfort zone.
Yeah.
I mean, having spent 5 decades in Washington, and particularly in his time as vice president under Obama, I think he understood that in those years, 2010 to 2012, was where Obama sort of turned his presidency around because he had a Republican majority in the House. So he was constantly able to pitch himself to the American people as saying, there's all this stuff we'd like to do, but we're scuppered by these dastardly Republicans who are mean and they're shilling for big business and so on. That's what Biden wants to do now, and it's pretty effective politics.
Well, tell me more about this kind of Made in America thing that he's trying to make happen now. You mentioned the CHIPS Act in your piece.
Well, the CHIPS Act was one of the first things he brought up, which is obviously giving $280 billion, I think it is, towards America's semiconductor industry and actually trying to freeze out China's semiconductor industry. There's also infrastructure, which he passed a big infrastructure bill. There's more to come. And that is going to be exclusively by Americans. So federally mandated projects will only buy American projects. So that's timber, copper, etc., etc. Right. And other presidents have committed to that, as he said, but they've always found ways around it. He's insisting that he's not going to do that. And that is kind of good populist catnip. Americans like to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. And is that why Trump praised him? Because as you write in your piece, even Trump has said, it's not natural for him, but you've got to give him credit for trying.
Yes. Well,
was it a bit backhanded?
That was a little bit backhanded because he was doing what Biden was doing, whereas pretending to be nice, but actually stabbing him in the back.
Right.
Because he posted it with a video about the border, which of course is Biden's big weak point for a lot of voters. He hasn't really made any steps towards securing the border, and there's a major illegal immigration crisis there. But yes, Trump did sound actually quite magnanimous. Give him credit for trying. As far as Trump goes, that's pretty generous.
But he did say that on Truth Social. I mean, this is a bit of a digression, but is he coming back to Twitter at any point? I mean, he now can, but he just seems to be holding out.
He hasn't done it yet.
Yeah.
The speculation is that he might, as his campaign intensifies, and that he's planning a big Facebook comeback. Okay. But that's just been reported. There's no sign of it yet.
Yeah, okay. Well, just going back to Biden then, I mean, you mentioned that foreign policy wasn't a heavy feature in this speech. Is that a surprise given how much, the Chinese spy balloon has been obsessing the American news agenda over the last week?
Yes, well, his team briefed out beforehand that he would not be mentioning the balloon.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they said the word balloon will not come up, and indeed it didn't come up. Although he did say, as we showed this week, when American sovereignty is threatened, we will act, and we did. But I think a lot of Americans find that story all very odd. It seemed to be only after the media sort of picked up on this story and it became a kind of outcry that Biden finally shot, or the American government finally shot down this balloon. So he sort of skimmed over that really overall.
Do you think he should have done? I mean, maybe he should have made it a point of saying, we react when events develop. Blinken's no longer going to China, at least in the short term. Look at us being tough on China. Do you think he should have made more of a point of saying that? Maybe,
although I think he's sticking quite closely to the Biden doctrine on China, which is cooperation where you can. Standing up where you should, and it's not an idiotic policy, but it's obviously quite hard to do at a time when you're simultaneously trying to say autocracy is on the rise, democracy has to defeat it, and yet we're going to keep cooperating with China.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of that, Zelensky is in London this week asking for more fighter jets. But the feeling that I get from Rishi Sunak is that he won't do anything that the Americans won't do. So do you think the Americans could be giving more to Ukraine to fight this other autocracy in the world?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Biden is nervous about being the obvious leader of the Ukrainian effort, even though it's very, very obvious to everybody that it's America that drives this train. So I think what you'll probably have again is what you had with the tanks, which is if the West supplies lots of jets to Ukraine, you will have other countries going first, getting ahead of them. Britain always leading the way. And then Biden sort of coming in behind, but with the actual stuff that matters, the volume of weaponry and money that matters.
Right, absolutely. And Freddie, just before we finish up, can you give British viewers an idea of how important the State of the Union is, and what kind of occasion is it meant to be? Because you mentioned that Bono was there, and I had a look online, and he was sitting next to Nancy Pelosi's husband. Is that the kind of thing that happens? That celebrities just drop in and out, and people are heckling? Like, what kind of vibe is that?
It's become this very weird American ritual,
right?
And it's a sort of weird carnival of imperial power, basically. And it was never meant to be this, as a lot of people have said this week. In the US Constitution, there is this line that the president should report from time to time to Congress, and so it could be an email, it could be a letter, or even a text message, or even a Truth Social post. But in fact, it's turned into this extraordinary set piece where the president sort of comes in. There's a lot of standing to applause, a lot of kind of fake politesse, but now there's also the heckling that's come in recently. It happened a lot with Trump. Nancy Pelosi, you'll remember, ripped up the speech behind him. Yesterday, Republicans were booing Biden and heckling him. So it has become this very odd fixture in the kind of American political media calendar. But I think a lot of Americans think it's a bit odd. And in fact, viewing figures, I think they peaked with Obama. I think they've been steadily on the decline. I don't have the latest ones for Biden, but I'm going to bet that they were quite low.
Is it just a matter of time before there's product placement?
Yeah. I think Trump even did a bit of that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I can't remember what with. But let's say that he did.
Freddie, thanks so much for joining Spectator TV.
Great pleasure.
That's it for this week. Once again, thanks to Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management for sponsoring the week in 60 minutes. Canaccord will provide you with the expertise you need to help you build your wealth with confidence. Visit candowealth.com for more information. And if you enjoy Spectator TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss any of our videos. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.